What happens when one of the most respected voices in natural history walks into what he believes is a celebration of his life's work, only to find himself facing a host determined to tear down everything he stands for? Tonight, we're uncovering one of the most shocking confrontations in late-night television history, when Sir David Attenborough discovered that not everyone appreciates decades of dedication to wildlife conservation. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me what you think about hosts who ambush their guests. Trust me, what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. The evening began with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a living legend. Sir David Attenborough, at 97 years old, had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his latest documentary series about endangered species. The production team had assured his representatives that this would be a respectful tribute to his remarkable career, focusing on his conservation efforts and the impact of his work on environmental awareness. As the beloved naturalist arrived at the studio, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had made him a treasured figure across generations. Dressed in his characteristic understated suit, he moved slowly but purposefully through the backstage area, greeting crew members with the genuine warmth that had endeared him to colleagues throughout his 70-year career in broadcasting. The host, however, was nowhere to be seen during the usual pre-show pleasantries. While most talk show hosts take time to meet their guests beforehand, establishing rapport and discussing the flow of the interview, this host remained conspicuously absent. Production assistants made excuses, claiming he was reviewing notes and preparing special questions for such an esteemed guest. What Sir David didn't know was that the host had spent the past week preparing not a tribute, but what he considered an exposé. Armed with cherry-picked quotes from climate change skeptics and fossil fuel industry talking points, the host had convinced himself that he was going to be the one to finally challenge what he saw as environmental propaganda masquerading as nature documentaries. The warning signs were subtle but present for those who knew how to read them. The usual pre-interview briefing was rushed and vague. The questions that were shared with Sir David's team beforehand were notably different. From the aggressive talking points the host had actually prepared, even the studio setup seemed designed more for confrontation than conversation, with the guest chair positioned lower than usual and additional cameras focused on capturing every reaction. As Sir David settled into the guest chair, he maintained his characteristic composure, but those who had worked with him for decades could detect a slight tension in his normally relaxed posture. The studio audience, filled with fans who had grown up watching his documentaries, gave him a warm welcome that seemed to lift his spirits and remind him why he had agreed to make this appearance. The host finally emerged from his preparation area with an energy that seemed oddly aggressive for someone about to interview a 97-year-old knight of the realm. His usual pre-show banter with the audience carried an undercurrent of excitement that felt more appropriate for a boxing match than a conversation with one of Britain's most beloved figures. When the cameras began rolling, the host's opening monologue contained several seemingly innocuous jokes about nature documentaries and wildlife conservation. But those familiar with his style could detect the subtle mockery woven throughout his remarks, setting up what was clearly intended to be a takedown disguised as an interview. Sir David, ever the professional, responded to the host's introduction with gracious thanks and a humble acknowledgement of the audience's warm reception. His opening remarks about the importance of understanding our natural world and our responsibility to protect it were delivered with the same passion and eloquence that had captivated audiences for generations. But as the first commercial break approached, the host's demeanor began to shift noticeably. His questions grew sharper, his tone more skeptical, and his body language increasingly aggressive. What had been presented as a celebration was clearly becoming something else entirely, and Sir David was beginning to realize that he had walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush. The production team, many of whom had worked on respectful interviews with other environmental figures, began exchanging worried glances. This wasn't the show they had prepared for, and they could sense that their beloved guest was about to face an ordeal that no one his age should have to endure on national television. As they returned from the commercial break, the host's mask began to slip completely, revealing the true nature of what he had planned for one of the most respected figures in broadcasting history. The audience, still unaware of what was coming, applauded warmly as the interview resumed, having no idea they were about to witness a character assassination attempt against a man who had devoted his entire life to educating and inspiring others about the natural world. The host leaned forward in his chair, adopting the posture of someone preparing for battle rather than conversation, and Sir David, with the wisdom that comes from nearly a century of life experience, recognized the shift immediately. What happened next would transform a routine, late-night interview into a confrontation that would shock everyone in that studio and millions of viewers around the world. The shift in the host's demeanor was as sudden as it was shocking. Gone was any pretense of respect or professional courtesy, as he launched into what could only be described as a calculated assault on Sir David's life work. "So David," he began, his tone dripping with false familiarity, "let's talk about how you've been scaring children for decades with your doom and gloom climate stories." The studio fell silent. Even the cameramen seemed to freeze, unsure whether they should continue filming what was clearly about to become a disaster. Sir David, with the composure that had served him well in encounters with dangerous wildlife, simply raised an eyebrow and replied, "I beg your pardon?" The host, apparently emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, pressed forward with his attack. "Come on, you've built an entire career on telling people that the world is ending, that animals are dying because of human activity. Don't you think you've been a bit dramatic? Some might say you've been spreading fear for profit." The audience began to murmur uncomfortably. These were people who had come to see a celebration of one of television's greatest figures, not witness him being attacked by someone young enough to be his grandson. Sir David leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap, and spoke with the measured tone that had narrated countless documentaries. "I have spent 70 years traveling to every continent on Earth, documenting the natural world as it truly exists. I have never exaggerated or dramatized what I have witnessed. If anything, the reality of what is happening to our planet's ecosystems is far more serious than anything I have ever been able to convey in a television program." But the host wasn't interested in dialogue or genuine discussion. He had clearly come prepared for battle, armed with talking points that seemed designed to provoke rather than inform. "But isn't it convenient that your solution to everything is more government regulation, more restrictions on businesses, more control over people's lives? Sounds like someone's been spending too much time with environmental activists instead of real scientists." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Here was a man who had worked with the world's leading scientists for decades, who had been knighted for his contributions to natural history and broadcasting, being accused of spreading propaganda. Sir David's eyes, still sharp despite his advanced age, focused intently on his interviewer. "I have worked alongside researchers, biologists, climatologists, and conservationists from every major university and scientific institution on the planet," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath its customary gentleness. "These are not activists with an agenda. These are dedicated scientists whose research I have had the privilege of helping to share with the public." The host laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine humor. "Scientists, right? The same scientists who have been wrong about climate predictions for decades? The same ones who said we'd be in an ice age, then global warming. Now it's climate change because they can't make up their minds?" Several audience members began to boo softly, but the host seemed to interpret this as encouragement rather than criticism. He was clearly enjoying what he saw as his moment of triumph over someone he had apparently decided represented everything wrong with environmental messaging. Sir David remained remarkably calm, but those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of his growing displeasure. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his usually relaxed posture became more rigid. "Young man," he said, using a tone that managed to be both gentle and devastating, "I have witnessed the effects of climate change firsthand across 7 decades of fieldwork. I have returned to locations I filmed in the 1950s to find them utterly transformed. I have watched species disappear, ecosystems collapse, and weather patterns shift in ways that would have been unimaginable when I began my career." The host, apparently missing the warning signs that he was pushing a very patient man too far, continued his assault. "But that's just natural change, isn't it? The Earth has always gone through cycles. Why should we believe that this time it's different, especially when the so-called solutions always seem to involve making life harder for ordinary people, while celebrities like you fly around the world making movies about polar bears?" The audience's discomfort was now palpable. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging worried glances, and some were beginning to voice their disapproval more loudly. The production staff looked mortified, clearly aware that their show was spiraling into something that would likely end their careers. Sir David sat in silence for a long moment, studying the host with the same intense focus he had once reserved for observing predators in the wild. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. "I have dedicated my entire life to understanding and sharing the wonder of the natural world. I have crawled through jungles, climbed mountains, and descended into ocean depths, not for fame or fortune, but because I believe that knowledge and understanding are humanity's greatest tools for survival." The host, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was now facing someone who had spent decades dealing with far more dangerous creatures than a disrespectful television host, pressed on with his attack. "Survival? That's pretty dramatic language for someone who makes nature documentaries. Maybe the real threat isn't climate change. Maybe it's fear-mongering by people who've lost touch with reality." That was the moment when everyone in the studio realized that the host had just made a catastrophic mistake. Sir David's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but the change was unmistakable to anyone watching closely. The kindly grandfather figure was still there, but now there was something else. Something that suggested this gentleman had limits, and those limits had just been crossed in the most public way possible. The transformation in Sir David Attenborough was subtle, but unmistakable. The gentle naturalist who had patiently endured insult after insult slowly straightened in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent nearly a century earning the respect of the entire world. "Lost touch with reality," he repeated, each word measured and deliberate. "Let me tell you about reality, young man." The host, perhaps finally sensing that he had awakened something he wasn't prepared to handle, tried to interrupt, but Sir David raised one weathered hand, and the gesture carried such quiet authority that the entire studio fell silent. "You sit behind this desk every night, making jokes and offering opinions about subjects you clearly know nothing about. I have spent 70 years in the field, documenting what is actually happening to our planet. Not what I think should be happening, not what would be convenient to believe, but what is actually occurring." The audience was completely captivated now, watching as one of the most beloved figures in television history defended not just his own reputation, but the integrity of scientific inquiry itself. Sir David's voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the weight of decades of experience and the moral authority of someone who had dedicated his life to truth. "You accuse me of fear-mongering," he continued, his eyes never leaving the host's increasingly uncomfortable face. "But I have seen fear, real fear, in the eyes of indigenous communities whose traditional hunting grounds have disappeared due to changing climate patterns. I have witnessed the confusion of polar bears searching for ice that no longer exists. I have documented the bleaching of coral reefs that have thrived for thousands of years, only to die within a single generation due to rising ocean temperatures." The host, clearly realizing that his ambush had backfired spectacularly, attempted to regain control of the situation. But surely you can admit that some of these claims have been exaggerated, that the environmental movement has sometimes been guilty of overselling the crisis. Sir David's response was swift and devastating. The only thing that has been exaggerated is humanity's ability to ignore clear evidence when it challenges our comfortable assumptions. I have never overstated the threats facing our natural world because the reality is far more serious than most people are prepared to accept. The studio was now completely silent except for Sir David's voice, which seemed to grow more powerful with each sentence. You want to discuss reality? The reality is that I have returned to filming locations after 30 or 40 years to find them utterly transformed. Forests where I once filmed now house shopping centers. Rivers that once teemed with life now run brown with pollution. Species that I documented in the 1960s are now extinct, gone forever because we refused to act when action might have made a difference. The host made one final desperate attempt to salvage his attack. But don't you think you have a responsibility to present a more balanced view, to give people hope instead of despair? What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Sir David leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Yet somehow every person in that studio heard every word with crystal clarity. "Hope?" he said, his voice carrying a mixture of sadness and steel. "You want to know about hope? Hope is what drives a 97-year-old man to continue traveling the world, documenting the wonders that still exist, fighting to preserve them for future generations. Hope is what motivates scientists to spend their entire careers studying climate patterns, not for fame or fortune, but because they believe that knowledge can lead to action." The host opened his mouth to respond, but Sir David wasn't finished. "But hope without truth is merely delusion. And the truth is that we are facing the greatest environmental crisis in human history. Not because I say so, not because environmentalists say so, but because the evidence, collected by thousands of researchers over decades of painstaking study, says so." Sir David slowly began to rise from his chair, his movements deliberate and dignified. "You invited me here tonight under false pretenses. You led me to believe this would be a respectful discussion about the natural world and conservation efforts. Instead, you have chosen to use your platform to attack not just me, but the entire scientific community that has dedicated their lives to understanding our planet." The audience began to applaud, softly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation. The host sat frozen, clearly realizing that he had not only failed in his attempted takedown, but had actually provided Sir David with a platform to deliver. One of the most powerful defenses of environmental science ever broadcast on television. "I have spent my entire adult life trying to share the wonder and beauty of the natural world with people like those in your audience tonight," Sir David continued, his voice now carrying across the studio like a force of nature itself. "I have crawled through mud, endured extreme temperatures, and put myself in danger countless times. Not for personal glory, but because I believe that understanding leads to appreciation, and appreciation leads to conservation." The host made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Sir David, please, let's not end this on a negative note. Surely we can find some common ground here." Sir David's response was delivered with the kind of devastating politeness that only comes from a lifetime of dealing with difficult situations with grace and dignity. Common ground requires mutual respect, something that has been notably absent from this conversation. You have shown disrespect not only to me personally, but to the thousands of dedicated scientists whose work I have had the honor of helping to share with the world. He began walking toward the exit, each step measured and purposeful. "I came here tonight hoping to inspire your audience to care about the natural world, to understand that we are all part of an interconnected web of life that requires our protection and stewardship. Instead, I have been subjected to an attack based on ignorance and predetermined hostility." As Sir David reached the edge of the stage, he turned back one final time to address not the host, but the audience directly. To those of you watching tonight, I want you to remember that the natural world is not a political issue. It is not a matter of opinion. It is not subject to debate based on convenience or economic interest. It is our home, our life support system, and our legacy to future generations. Treat it with the respect it deserves. The standing ovation that followed was unlike anything the show had ever experienced. The audience was on their feet, many with tears in their eyes, applauding. Not just a television legend, but a man who had just demonstrated what it means to stand up for truth and dignity in the face of ignorance and hostility. As Sir David disappeared behind the curtain, the camera captured the host sitting alone at his desk, surrounded by the sound of an audience that had completely turned against him. The man who had thought he could tear down a legend had instead witnessed the kind of grace under pressure that creates legends in the first place. That's the story of how Sir David Attenborough turned what was meant to be an ambush into a masterclass in dignity, integrity, and the power of a life well lived. What do you think about hosts who try to ambush respected guests? Should Sir David have stayed to continue the debate, or was he right to walk away with his dignity intact? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of grace under pressure.